Our guest is Dr. O'Hanlon. He's a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution. He's a graduate of Princeton, as nearly all of you know now. He's got his master's, his AB degrees from Princeton. His MS in engineering is from Princeton. His Master of Arts degree is from Princeton. And his PhD is from Princeton. And you think it's difficult to get in, it's more difficult to get away, apparently. And to underline that, he's now a visiting lecturer at Princeton. Too much of a good thing, perhaps. In any case, it's a wonderful background. He's been with the Institute for Defense Analyses. He was with the Congressional Budget Office before that, doing national security type work. He continues to do that at the Brookings Institution. He's written extensively. His areas of expertise are real and numerous. They focus on the national security area. He's writing on the future of arms control. He's doing defense strategy and budget at the present time. It deals with military technology. In short, he's very thoroughly grounded in the national security area. In addition, he's done work on peacekeeping, homeland security, and importantly from our dimension, our interest, also North Korea and Iraq. Robert Osgood years ago wrote a book, which I know Dr. O'Hanlon is familiar with, called Limited War, in which he put forward the proposition that it would be very difficult to carry on a limited war for an extensive period of time in a democracy. You don't have the support of a major conflict, rallying public opinion, and when dissent does grow, as it inevitably will, it can be voiced in a democracy, hence a limited period of time. And certainly what we're doing today in the world is a limited war of a kind, not in the classic sense, but certainly of a kind. And we face not only the questions of where we stand in Iraq, but where it fits within a domestic political context as well. Brookings does a marvelous job of staying abreast of these things. Dr. O'Hanlon and some of his colleagues keep their eye on nearly all of the major variables in the Iraqi situation, and we're absolutely delighted that he shares his general wisdom with us tonight, as well as his particular information with respect to that problem. Dr. O'Hanlon.
Thank you. That's a very kind introduction, and it's a real treat to be here. You folks put on one of the best shows going, and it doesn't hurt to have such enthusiasm and a 21st story view and the great town of Baltimore with the colors of Princeton with your baseball team, which is one of the reasons that I have such a special affinity for this place. We obviously have a tough topic to talk about tonight, but you're used to that, so I'm sure you won't mind gritting your teeth with me and thinking it through for the next hour or so. The topic of Iraq, how's it going? Where are we headed? How's it been working? I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the should we have gotten into it and a lot of the debate we heard last year in the presidential race, and a lot of the debate I think a lot of us will continue to have at various points indefinitely. I think this will be a big issue, almost on a par with Vietnam in terms of the strength of people's feelings about whether we should have or shouldn't have for many, many years. But I'm not going to do that tonight. We can happily, if you like, go into that in the discussion period. But what I want to talk about, again, is an update. How do things look right now? And one more, and therefore also where are things likely to be headed and what are our policy options from this point onward. In addition to not wanting to just revisit issues we've all spent a lot of time debating and hearing about, one more reason I don't want to spend a lot of time on the past, and I'll just tell you where my biases are, is that I was a conditional supporter of the war. I was not an adamant opponent. Like many of my colleagues in the think tank world, I had a lot of qualms about how it was done, both in terms of the strength of the coalition and especially the preparation for the period after Saddam fell. And a lot of the think tank community, I think, at least in this case, was right to say, you better give a lot of serious thought to what happens after Saddam is gone. And on this point, I think the think tank world and the State Department were correct, and the Pentagon did not do a very good job, unfortunately. And I'm happy to talk about that issue as well. But leave that as it may, be that as it may, I think that history is going to have a verdict on Iraq that's going to be based mostly not on our strong views about whether we should have or shouldn't have in theory, but on how it turns out. In other words, I think the strategic update now and in the future is going to basically decide whether history sees this as a smart war to have fought or not. Because, just to summarize, and this is my only brief mention of the debates that have been so much on our minds for the last 2 or 3 years, I think both opponents of this war and supporters of this war have very powerful arguments on their side. And at the moment, most of us tend to lean one way or another. Most of us were either opponents or proponents and tended to make the arguments. I've heard a lot of people make very powerful arguments very cogently. And there are, I think, very cogent arguments on both sides about whether we should have fought this war or not. Obviously, opponents say Saddam was not an imminent threat. We know that now even better than we did then. But even then, we didn't see him attacking his neighbors for the 12 previous years. Opponents also say containment policy was working reasonably well. They say that it was not overtaxing our military. We had figured out how to minimize the strain on Air Force pilots who were doing the no-fly zones. We weren't losing people in the operation. We were letting the Iraqi people get some benefits from the Oil for Food program, despite all of its imperfections. Things were basically okay. Why did we have to disrupt a basically contained problem and cause so many other problems for our own military, for our national image around the world, et cetera? And that's a very reasonable set of arguments. But then proponents of the war will say, well, listen, we didn't totally know what Saddam had before this war. And in fact, the UN and the French and everybody else thought he had chemical and biological weapons. And German intelligence thought he would have a nuclear weapon within 5 or 6 years. It wasn't just, the right-wingers in the Bush administration. It was most of the world's major intelligence outfits thought that the Ba'athist regime was headed towards nuclear weapons and that it almost surely had chemical and biological weapons. We knew Saddam Hussein was willing to use them, and he had used them. We knew that deterrence was not perfect with Saddam because as late as 1993, he tried to assassinate former President Bush. He also attacked the Kurds in 1996, and who knows what he might have tried to get away with, even if, admittedly, the more honest of them will say there was no demonstrated connection between Saddam and al-Qaeda of any meaningful variety, and certainly no operational significance. So both sides, I think, have pretty powerful arguments. And again, I'm not going to try to convince you. We've heard enough about this debate already. I just want to put a postulate on the table, which is that, leaving aside our own personal feelings, history's verdict about whether this was a smart war to fight or not is going to depend mostly on how it turns out. Because the other arguments, I think, when you take a step back, sort of cancel each other out. They're sort of equally persuasive, or at least they are competitive enough with each other, that when you look at this thing from 20, 30, 50 years perspective, halfway through this century, people are going to look back on whether Iraq turned out to be a reasonably democratic place that perhaps helped transform the Middle East, at least gradually and at least incrementally, and whether we ultimately got out of the place and had something we could call a success for American foreign policy or not. And I think that verdict is going to be the most important verdict in determining whether people see the war itself as a good idea. Also, the way in which it relates to the broader struggle against terror. If we continue to struggle, if we continue to be seen as waging a unilateral operation, as occupying an Arab country, if that perception continues and we get a bad outcome, then I think people will tend to say it wasn't worth fighting because it might have made the global jihad problem worse. It may have stoked this image of a United States that was out for its own imperialistic ambitions. It just wanted Iraqi oil. We just wanted to go after our nemesis, Saddam Hussein. You know all the arguments. Some of you may even make them because there are obviously Americans who feel that this was part of the Bush administration's agenda. I'm no supporter of the Bush administration, but I give them their fair due. I think they had plenty of good reasons to go after Saddam, and I think their reasoning was sincere, even if their arguments were sometimes exaggerated, and even if their decision may or may not, in the end, have been a smart one, and their methods and their preparation for this may not have been very sufficient. But leave that as it may. Again, the point here is, how are we doing now? And where's this thing seem to be headed? And again, I think that's going to be the big determinant of how history views this. We've tried to do something at Brookings called the Iraq Index, which is the basis for most of what I'm going to talk about tonight. And it's a largely statistical compendium of trends in Iraq. And we have this on our website at brookings.edu if you're interested in looking at it. The New York Times op-ed page has also been kind enough to let us distill or summarize a version of it every 3 months ever since late 2003. And we just had one last Friday in Friday's paper. And again, everybody in this room knows full well you cannot reduce a counterinsurgency operation to numbers. And we sort of learned that lesson in Vietnam. You better not try to measure progress against a resistance movement strictly based on criteria that are quantifiable, because usually you pick the wrong criteria, or your data is not very good, or you kid yourselves about which trends are most important, or you just put on blinders because your political investment is so great that you skew the numbers either subconsciously or intentionally in a way that makes their ultimate verdict not very compelling. So there's a big danger to doing this kind of thing with numbers. There's a big danger to our Iraq index. And our response to that risk is to say, first of all, we agree. You cannot come up with a formula that's going to take all of our numbers and turn it into a predictor of success. Or if there is such a formula, we're not smart enough to figure out what it is. We're just going to try to give you, the observer, the scholar, the citizen, as much information as we can. And sometimes we may write about this issue ourselves in policy terms, but the index is just designed to measure how things are going, wherever we can get data. How do we get the data? Sometimes the U.S. government provides it. There is some information that comes out weekly from the State Department. The Pentagon used to do that until the transfer of sovereignty in Iraq last June 28th. Now it's a State Department service, and you can get it on their webpage. There's some information that my friends in the government have been willing to try to get for me when they can get unclassified information that's not in those State Department updates, but still can be of help. And then we try to just scour every other source we can come up with. Journalistic accounts, IMF data on the economy, independent media and how they're doing in Iraq, and we just try to present all the trends. So that's the basis for what I want to talk about. The way we organize the data is, again, tapping into traditional theory of counterinsurgency, that we all know if we've studied this field, and again, many people in this room I know have done so, that counterinsurgency requires a number of successful efforts on a number of different fronts. I don't mean physical battlefield fronts exclusively. I mean political, economic, and security fronts. And so we try to group things into those three broad categories. How is the economy doing in Iraq? How is the security environment doing? And how are the politics going? And so you think of counterinsurgency and a nation-building effort as basically a three-legged stool with these three pillars, the economy, the security environment, and the politics, being, in some measure, all necessary. All of them have to improve with time, or it's very difficult to defeat an insurgency. That's the daunting way to look at it. The more reassuring way to look at it, and I think this is applicable to Iraq right now, if one piece of it's not going as well, the other piece may be able to help pull you along and keep some positive momentum, even when certain objective indicators are bad. And in fact, I think that is the situation right now in Iraq. You've already been very patient. Let me give you my one-sentence thesis for tonight, which I should have done sooner, but here it is right now. The politics in Iraq overall are going quite well, in my opinion. A lot of problems, a lot of risks, a lot of fragility, but overall the politics are going quite well, and thank God for that, because the economy is mediocre and the security environment is downright poor, even 2 years later. And now let me try to explain what I mean. And when I put these three thoughts together, and again, you may challenge me, and I hope you will, on these overall assessments, but when I put them together as I see them, I don't know how to predict where Iraq's going to wind up, because I can see equal parts good news and bad news. If I'm right and the security environment really is not much improved at all in 2 years, that's a very, very sobering thought. And I'll try to back that up, and I'm afraid that is my opinion. I don't think it's gotten better in 2 years. In fact, it's actually May 2005 was much worse than May 2003. Of course, May 2003 was a hiatus after the invasion before the insurgency really got going. But unfortunately, May 2005 looked about as bad as any other month, with the exception of just a couple. And so if you look at that moment in time, that recent moment in time, it's not very promising. On the other hand, how do you weigh that against the fact that the Shia and the Kurds are remarkably working together within their own communities and with each other? And they're now at least trying to reach out a hand to the Sunni Arabs. And again, I'll talk more about this in a minute, but that very impressive political trend in Iraq today gives hope. Because if the Sunni Arabs ever decide at the level of their leadership and their clerics that they don't want this war to continue, it won't. I mean, they have a lot of ability, I think, to make this thing end. And so to the extent a political system and process begin that really enlists their cooperation and support, I think we have excellent hope, despite the fact the security environment has not yet improved. Okay, so that's how I try to think about it. That's my sort of bottom line. Let me now please go through a few more of the specifics in each of these categories. And then I'll try to wrap it up briefly and get into a conversation. In security terms, let's get the bad news out of the way first. May 2005 saw more Iraqi security personnel killed than any other month since Saddam was overthrown. About 275 Iraqi police or army personnel were killed, which is, on the one hand, it's impressive how much they're willing to keep joining these security forces, and they want to fight for their country, and they're prepared to die for their country. On the other hand, the fact that this month's total was so much worse, it was actually about 30% worse, I think, than the previous worst month. Overall, about twice as bad as the average in the last 2 years. This is horribly depressing. And it suggests that even 2 years' worth of tactical improvements in our own counterinsurgency operations and a year worth of training now under General David Petraeus, as well as the year before that, we didn't quite have our act together, but we were trying to train the Iraqis. All that training and all that tactical innovation so far has not produced much benefit. To the extent we've gotten better, the insurgents have gotten better at least as fast. American troops, we lost 77 people in May, which is well above the average for the entire 2-year period. And it's actually up there with, if you take away the months of November and April 2004, the months when we had the big raids in Fallujah, May 2005 was almost as bad as it got. I think January 05, we lost 100 people. There were a couple other months we lost close to 100. But losing close to 80 people in 1 month was actually maybe the 6th or 7th worst month we've had in the whole 2.25 years that we've been in Iraq. American wounded, very high as well. Iraqi civilian casualties also appear to have been higher than in any previous month, which again, the data on this is pretty hard to measure, and obviously I wasn't sending interns over to Iraq to gather this kind of information, and the U.S. military has had some mixed feelings about accumulating this kind of information itself. Nobody wants to relive the Vietnam body bag approach to measuring progress in a counterinsurgency, and so the military has tended to be pretty reluctant to systematically provide data on how many insurgents they think they killed. They've also been reluctant to provide data on how many innocent Iraqis we think have died from whatever cause in the course of the counterinsurgency. But there are a lot of NGOs and journalists brave enough to work in Iraq, and they provide reports, and people can try to scour the reports and create databases. We're not doing all of this ourselves. Sometimes we tap into others' databases, and you can see their databases on our webpage too, if you look for the references. But basically, it looks as if Iraqi civilian casualties were higher in May 2005 than in any previous month. In addition to that, there's very poor data on the crime rate in Iraq. The number of people being kidnapped, being robbed in the streets, being mugged, and being killed for purely personal or criminal reasons, not for reasons of insurgency or war. But as well as we can tell, the crime rate in Iraq today is still actually much worse than it was in the latter years of Saddam Hussein's regime. Now, to give perspective to this, obviously the crime rate today is much better than it was when Saddam was slaughtering hundreds of thousands of people in the late 80s and early 90s. I'm not trying to say that Iraq today is worse than it was 15 years ago. But unfortunately, I think a fair-minded analysis has to conclude that Iraq today is worse than it was 3 or 4 or 5 years ago under Saddam. If you were just some regular Iraqi trying to send your kids to school, trying to go to the shop down the street to get food, hoping that your home will not be invaded just for a simple criminal reason. Obviously, if you're a political activist, you're better off today than you were under Saddam at any time. But if you're just a regular Iraqi citizen, I'm afraid your life is probably more imperiled today than it was in 2000, 2001, 2002, as best we can tell from the information we have. And I've not wanted to believe this conclusion, but everything I've seen tells me it's right. So security, I think, can be summarized in one word. It is poor. And I know why General Myers said on April 27th that he thought we were starting to win and all the trends were in the right direction. Because after the January 30th elections, things really did look good for a couple of months. Not everybody in the U.S. military took this as some huge sign of accomplishment. I went to CENTCOM down in Tampa on March 18th, and I was very kindly treated to a number of meetings and a number of conversations, and a number of military personnel there cautioned me, who was not any big rah-rah supporter of the Bush administration or any huge optimist on Iraq. They cautioned me from being too optimistic based on the 7 or 8 weeks of good news we had had since the elections. So a lot of our military personnel and our military planners at this point really have very level-headed views of how to ascertain progress. But unfortunately, General Myers still was making comments at that point and later, and some others were as well, that they probably regret at this point and certainly cannot back up at this point. The period of the last 6 to 8 weeks has basically reversed, in security terms, the progress we saw after January 30th. That's just telling you the numbers. And you can dispute the importance of the numbers, or we can all hope they're not going to continue. Maybe this was a blip. Maybe there was some reason why the second half of April and May were much worse than what we're going to see this summer. But all I can tell you is the progress we thought we had seen after January 30th in the security environment is gone. And I'm just trying to be pithy and blunt so we look at this in an analytically fair way. I'm going to come now to some gradually better news as I try to work towards the conversation I look forward to having with you in just 10 or 15 minutes. But let me now talk about economics. Oh, by the way, on security, there is, of course, one important bit of good news, which is that we are now, I think, doing a reasonably good job of training the Iraqi security forces. And that really has become our exit strategy. I think 2 years ago, we all hoped that our exit strategy would be basically overthrowing Saddam, and that once he was gone, Iraq would hold together. This was certainly the prevailing conceptual framework the Bush administration used, and they did not do a good job of planning for the post-Saddam period. They did not think the stabilization mission would be very hard. They didn't have a very sophisticated plan to deal with it. At this point, we know better, but I do think that we basically are going to have to continue to contend with the difficulty of stabilizing the place for quite a while. But now in terms of security forces, that job can increasingly go to Iraqis. Unfortunately, it's been happening very slowly. Various reports on how proficient the Iraqi security forces are. It appears that only 3 or 4 battalions out of their total force of 80-some battalions right now is fully up to snuff in terms of equipment and training. So only a few thousand people are in really top-tier security forces at this time. But I think probably more like 30 to 50,000 are in pretty good shape. And within a year or so, we should have a lot of them at least trained to a rudimentary level of proficiency. That's the best news I can give you on the security front. Pretty much everything else is not very good. And I hope you challenge me, but I hope you can show me that I'm wrong, but I don't see any other good news in security terms to speak of. The economic news is much more complex, and there is actually a lot of good news here, but there's also a lot of bad news. I don't know which to start with. Let me get the bad news out of the way, and you won't think I'm, hopefully I'll work towards a more positive finish. The unemployment rate. The unemployment rate is, again, something the U.S. government has not really wanted to measure very much, or hasn't had very good data about, has not wanted to talk very much about. Unfortunately, it's still quite high, as best we can tell. 30 to 50%. We think it's probably, we estimate 30 to 40% in our actual Iraq index. There are some Iraqis who think it's still much higher. The problem, of course, is that turning around an economy like this is very hard to do. And we probably went into Iraq with a little bit too much of a strategy of fix the electricity grid and the Iraqis will be happy. We can all understand that on a night like this in Baltimore, and it's 20 degrees hotter in Baghdad right now. And Iraqis, you know, are not really in a developing country. They're an oil-rich country. They actually expect a certain amount of reasonable standard of living. And we went in with the approach to fix the infrastructure first as the big priority. But we didn't get enough Iraqis with jobs. It would have been hard to do under the best of circumstances. Unfortunately, our plan did not really emphasize this. And as in many big development projects, and again, I know people in this room have some experience with these sorts of things, you sort of have a trickle-down effect where the people who are near to the Westerners, who have big wads of money in their pockets, can get jobs, drive taxis, set up restaurants, et cetera. So there's a certain amount of economic stimulus from that, but it's not a very efficient way of creating jobs. And it does cater to certain pockets of the country, not the Sunni Triangle so much, not certain other parts of the state. And so what we see is that the unemployment rate may be better than it was 2 years ago, lower than it was 2 years ago, but it's probably still quite a bit worse than under Saddam Hussein. And what this means, to be blunt, is you have too many angry young men on the street who are unemployed. That makes them both more vulnerable, and I say this as a man, so I'm not so much a young one anymore, but nonetheless, we men are the problem in insurgencies. We're the ones who get angry and listen to the rhetoric from the mosques and pick up a RPG for $50 and fire it at a passing troop convoy. That's what's happening in Iraq. You have a hardcore committed group of jihadists from abroad, but that's probably no more than 1,000 people at a time. You have, from what the U.S. government estimates, and you can, you know, the way we do that, of course, is to look at all the people we capture and try to figure out how many of them are foreigners based on their identity papers, based on their accents, what have you. And that always seems to be in the range of maybe 5% of the total insurgents. And so it looks like this is primarily a Sunni Arab-based insurgency. And some of these people are former Baathists, clearly, and probably irredeemable. But a lot of them, I believe, and the U.S. intelligence community believes, to be essentially disaffected Sunni Arab fence straddlers who would have gone either way depending on where they saw the momentum and where they saw their own economic and other interests going in Iraq. And unfortunately, a lot of them have joined the insurgency out of anger, out of boredom, out of desire to make $50 firing an RPG or planting an improvised explosive device. And so we've seen a lot more of that than we would have hoped, and I think unemployment has contributed. So unemployment is not good. The electricity production rate, the average electricity power in Iraq today is below Saddam Hussein levels. This is actually incredibly disturbing news because we actually had it up almost to about Saddam Hussein levels within 8 or 10 months of the invasion. But sabotage has been a huge problem. And we just have been very frustrated in our ability to get the power consistently turned on. To some extent, there's been some compensation, and there's more smaller generators, and more people have backup contingency plans. But overall, the electricity production in Iraq is not good. But now let me gradually warm up to a little better economic news. First of all, there's a lot more bustle in the streets of Iraq. And I say this primarily from others telling me. I've only been there once, and that was a while ago. It was September '03. So this is not firsthand data. But everybody I've talked to who's been in Iraq and who had some basis for comparison with the previous period says there's more energy in the streets. There's just more lively human activity. There are more goods available for purchase. More people have money. Of course, a lot of people don't. That's the unemployment side of things. But overall, the average level of energy, the amount of traffic is up. Of course, that means there are also long gasoline lines. Not all this is good. Anybody who lives in this area knows that traffic has a downside as well as an upside. And so, you know, it's not all good. But for the most part, there is a greater energy, a greater vitality in the Iraqi economy, at least on the street, in the bazaars, in just the livelihoods of people. Income levels, as I mentioned, are also up. Creation of certain kinds of new institutions, new kinds of businesses, stock market is starting to boom, trading 3 or 4 times as many shares as were being traded just a couple of months ago, several billion shares a month now. It's the first time in Iraq. So there's reason for hope. There's a foundation of future economic strength that's being laid. And fuel supply for heating and cooking is good, even though electricity is mediocre. Almost all the estimated requirement for Iraqi kerosene and benzene, things like that, is now available. And so if you put all these different pieces together, you look at an Iraqi economy that is mixed. There's a lot of unemployment, but there's also a lot of growing income. The GDP growth rate seems to be fairly good. The bustle in the streets seems to be fairly healthy. There is a fair amount of energy in the cities, and a fair amount of optimism in people's minds and lives. And now let me get to that point, the politics. And by politics, I mean not only what's happening in Parliament, what's happening in the government, but this basic sense of optimism among the people. I'm going to finish with that point because I want to finish on a hopeful note, not so much as an analyst, but as an American. I mean, we have all these troops in Iraq. We've committed so much of our national treasure. Even those of us who even those of you who were skeptical of the war, maybe opposed it outright, I think virtually all of us would agree that some people would like to withdraw, and Senator Biden himself said today, apparently on Capitol Hill, that if things don't get quite a bit better in a year, he may be one of them. But I think for the most part, most of us still think that we have a certain amount of commitment that's going to be pretty hard to walk away from. And so I want to finish on a positive note for that reason. But, so I'll finish with the issue of Iraqi morale, which I think is the single most impressive thing of all. But let me talk a little bit more about the formal politics and the government before I do that. You all know what's going on with the Sunni Arab community. It's a very diverse community. It's about 5 million people. In that community, you have most of the former top Baathists. You also have a lot of tribes, some of which Saddam treated well, others of which he hated because they were rivals to his own favored tribes. So you have some natural allies and some very committed natural enemies of the new government and of the United States. You have the Islamic scholar and cleric communities of the Sunni Arab persuasion, most of whom have been very adamantly anti-U.S. And the nicest thing they basically ever said in the last 2 years is, okay, maybe we'll think about trying to get people to stop attacking other Iraqis, but we fundamentally insist on the right to keep attacking Americans because they're occupiers. That's about the nicest thing the Sunni Arab clerics and scholars have said, and the most hopeful thing. And we've encouraged, to our credit, I think, as a country, we've encouraged the Shia and the Kurds to view that kind of a statement as positive development, even though it doesn't mean any benefit for our own people in the near term. But it does suggest that, to the extent we gradually can pass the baton to Iraqi security forces, gradually pass the baton to the Iraqi political class, that the Sunni Arabs may gradually tamp down their support for the insurgency. As you know, the Shia and the Kurds have magnificently invited the Sunni Arabs into the government for no particular reason. American politicians wouldn't do that to some group that had won, 10 seats in a 275-seat parliament and give them 1/6 of all the seats in the cabinet just because they thought it was smart to do so. It was in their own enlightened self-interest in the long term. We don't do that in this country. If somebody loses the election, they're out. And the days of sort of reaching out to the other side don't seem to be very prevalent here anymore. But in Iraq, the Shia and the Kurds are definitely trying to bring in the Sunnis. And they're smart to do it. It would be a mistake not to. But it's not easy when these people are people who killed your cousins and your friends and your family, and, because they were the Baathists. And a lot of them were bad guys and worked with Saddam, or at least tacitly supported him. And now these very people, or at least the tribes from which they come, are being given positions in government by Shia and Kurds who have no legal requirement to do so because they dominated the elections on January 30th. So it's extremely hopeful that this happened. And now, those of you, I know there are a lot of people in this room who read this stuff very carefully in the paper, you know that the Constitution Writing Committee, which has to do its work this summer, is presently made up primarily of the winners of the elections, but they're trying to reach out and include a lot more Sunni Arabs in the process as well. And so all of that is very good, and the Sunni Arabs, at least some of them, some of the time, have been impressed by this themselves, or at least they have started to say, you know, maybe we really are better off trying to join this process, because what are our real alternatives? If you think about it and you're a Sunni Arab, you don't have any good choices. Your only real hope is that somehow, if you're a committed Ba'athist, your only real hope is that you could drive the Americans out, destroy the existing Iraqi government, and come back to power. That's getting to be a tall order. President Bush has been pretty clear about his commitment to this. The Iraqi government is becoming more and more strong in its position. The Iraqi security forces are becoming, I think, a potential match in any kind of a pitched traditional battle for the remnants of the Ba'athists. They obviously are not good enough to stop the insurgents, but if it were a pitched battle for power in Baghdad, I do not believe the Sunni Arabs are in a position to win that fight any longer. I think they know it. So their only option really is to maybe work for secession, but they have no oil on their territory to speak of. If they get secession, they lose. Sunni Arabs do not want an outcome in which the Shia get all the oil fields in the southeast and the Kurds get most of the oil fields in the north. So the Sunni Arabs don't really have a good option there either. And so I think when they think coolly about this, if we can get them to a point where they are going to think coolly, we have a good chance of prevailing, because they are much better off hoping for relatively equitable distribution of resources inside of a unified Iraq than any other outcome, just in terms of the basic facts of the matter. But again, that's a conclusion that's been hard for them to come to, and I think it's going to continue to take more time. So how much time do we have? Well, you know, there's a big, and I'll wrap up here. There's a lot going on. The Constitution has to be written by mid-August. It has to be approved by mid-October. It has to then lead to an election for a more permanent government by the end of this calendar year. All that stuff can be allowed to slip up to 6 months, but there's a real priority on keeping to these schedules. I think the Bush administration is very proud of turning over sovereignty last June on schedule, and also of having the elections January 30th. I actually think they were right to try to really make those deadlines stick, and I think they'll try very hard to make these deadlines stick. But we all know the insurgency is not going to be defeated in 6 or 8 more months if we haven't been able to use our very best troops to defeat it in 2.25 years. So it's going to keep going. And why do we have hope and why do we have time if this insurgency is likely to keep going? Well, I think the main reason is the Iraqi people. And what's remarkable is if you look at their support on January 30th for the election process, if you look at what they say in public opinion polls about their optimism for the future, they may be angry as heck at us. They may think that George Bush came in here to get their oil. They may think that he didn't bother to come up with a decent plan to stabilize the country because he just didn't care. They may think all those things, but they also remain at least slightly grateful to us. And more importantly, even if they don't acknowledge gratitude to us, they remain hopeful for their own future. And this is backed up in many different polls that have been done inside Iraq by many different organizations, some of them affiliated with the United States, others not. And I think it's very hard to question the basic validity of these poll results. And they've held up through a very difficult couple of years that we've been discussing in the last half hour, and that we've all been reading about and following for that whole time. So I think the Iraqi people are likely to hang in there. It doesn't mean the Sunni Arab political leaders will hang in there. And they are really, I think, the big question mark. If they go the right way, if they keep gradually integrating into this process, I think we're in pretty good shape. Because the Shia and the Kurds, in my opinion, in Iraq, are behaving in a heroic way. These groups, these large groups, are not fighting amongst themselves. They're not fighting each other. They're inviting the Sunni Arabs in. Yes, they want to make sure Ba'athists don't come back. Yes, they want to be tough on individual Ba'athist leaders. But they are not particularly interested in lording it over the Sunni Arabs. And they are really showing a lot of political sophistication in how they handle it. So you have 80% of the country acting in a pretty impressive way. You have 70% of Iraqis in public opinion polls saying they're optimistic about the future. 75% of them are supportive of the current government. And even among the Sunni Arab population, the numbers are still below 50% to all those questions, but they are headed upward in the right direction, and they're over 40%. So I'm still hopeful. I'm not predicting anything, except I will say this. For me, my most optimistic and most pessimistic scenarios are looking less likely all the time. I think what we're likely to wind up is something in the broad range of what you could call a Lebanon on the Euphrates. Lebanon as it was in the 70s and 80s, a violent democracy that only gradually but still progressively improves. And I'll leave it to you to tell me if that's better or worse than what was there before. If we get that, I would say it's better. Whether it's worth the cost is perhaps another debate, or another way to look at the same debate. But I think we're likely to wind up with something preferable to seeing Saddam Hussein and then someday perhaps his sons Uday or Qusay run this regime. Therefore, I'm hopeful still we'll wind up in a better place than we began. But unfortunately, I cannot say we're there yet. And I do think when the Bush administration has gotten optimistic in the last few weeks in various comments that have been made, they've gotten ahead of themselves because the data and the trends do not back up any kind of declaration of imminent victory right now, but there still is plenty of hope. And that's a very mixed message, but I don't see any other way, to be honest, to the information I see, and I look forward to your reactions in the discussion. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Michael. It's wonderful. Yes, sir. 2 questions. Why not emphasize oil production more? And why not use more of the unemployed as security guards?
Well, it's a good question, but I think, to be honest with you, we've tried this strategy and it hasn't worked because we created something called the Facility Protection Service in the 2003 time period, which was basically a lower tier, less proficient security force inside Iraq. And the idea was just to guard oil pipelines. Problem is, turns out a quarter of those people wound up being saboteurs. So it's very hard to screen and have any confidence. Barry Posen, my old professor from school, wrote a great New York Times op-ed today in which he talked about the degree of infiltration of insurgents inside many of the different organizations we're trying to build up or work with. And that's definitely been a problem. So the Iraqi oil infrastructure, you're right, we wanted to build that up and protect it, but unfortunately there have been anywhere from 10 to 15 attacks per month, successful attacks per month, ever since the invasion against that very infrastructure. And so it just hasn't worked the way you said.
Would you comment on the dynamic of secularism and theocracy within Iraq?
Yeah, it's a very intelligent and important question, well put. I think that, you know, the conventional wisdom on Iraq is it was a secular state, as you say, but it was also, of course, run by the Baathists and the Sunni Arabs more generally for many, many decades. We believe in democracy. We're helping the Shia largely run the show, or at least hopefully them in conjunction with others. And the Shia are different in their views and in their religion than the Sunni Arabs, and I think they are less secular. Having said that, my sense is that you have some fairly responsible Shia who recognize the Kurds are relatively secular, the Sunni Arabs are relatively secular, and moreover, if you decide to make this into a strict theocracy, you have an inevitable clash between Shia and Sunni, 2 very different versions of Islam. And they're Shia, of course, but they have the other 40% of the country that's not. So I think the Grand Ayatollah al-Sistani and other Shia leaders are actually behaving with a fair amount of restraint so far. And they're not going to answer your question in the terms you want them to, because they realize to say we have a secular state is going to disappoint a lot of their own people. And to say they have a theocracy or religious state is going to disappoint the other 40%. And they're going to find their own way, and it's not going to be at either of the extremes that you've laid out. It's a very important sort of debate, conceptual framework to keep in mind, but the Shia are showing enough sophistication, I think, to avoid trying to answer it in the very simple terms that some people would like them to. And so my guess is, over time, the Iraqi people have shown themselves to be relatively secular by the standards of many Islamic countries. So I think there's a lot to the general thrust of your point. But I think it's going to be a more complex mix than one or the other.
Would you comment on the observation that discontent is so great with this war effort that it may have a serious negative effect upon our political culture?
Well, it's a very powerful statement, and I can't begin to challenge it, and I won't challenge it. I'll just try to balance it in a way that I think this is the sort of thing I believe, and I'm not a spokesman for the Bush administration, as I hope I've made clear. But I think what I can do is just tell one small anecdote. I went out to an Army base in Arkansas a couple of weeks ago to be part of a conference, and a very impressive 23-year-old man was my escort to and from the airport, and he had been to Iraq twice, and he was in between deployments. And I was just trying to, in a subtle way, get some sense of how he felt about things, and I couldn't expect him to just unleash about his politics, having just met me. But he said, you know, I really want to go back. And he said, it feels to me like I'm not doing anything here. We got a war to win over there. I want to go back. And, you know, he meant it. Well, let me finish. I want to finish the point. It's an important point. Your point's important, so is this, because this is equally sincere. And there are a lot of people who feel this way in this country. And all I'm saying is, you know, I think these, I'm glad I'm not a parent of somebody who's 18 right now who's being recruited. I'll be selfish enough to admit that, and I hear your point. But I also admire the kids who go over. And I think they are fighting for something that is entirely defensible in terms of the moral benefit to that country it could bring if done well. Have they been let down by their political leadership? I agree with you. Not nearly as strongly as you put it, but I think that the sheer competence of some of the effort here has been lacking. That's where I would have my problems. The lack of proper planning for the post-Saddam period, I think, has allowed the insurgency to take off in a way it might not have otherwise done. But having said that, there are a lot of people who are very proud to serve, and I admire them. And I haven't done something like that in my life. I did Peace Corps, but that's nothing compared to what these people are doing in terms of the bravery. And they're fighting to depose a horrible dictator who was one of the most brutal people of the late 20th century. And I'm very glad he's gone. And so on that point, I will wrap myself in the flag and say that I'm proud that our country got rid of Saddam Hussein, despite all the other things that went wrong with this and that are debatable.
How do you think that the political military complex views the war, as a success or a failure?
I guess there are a number of ways I could try to interpret your question. Let me maybe try a couple. One is, if your concern is that the defense budget should rise, then yes, it's a success. We're spending a lot of money on the military right now. However, most of them are not making a lot of money building things because we're mostly spending money on people and ammunition and maintenance, and most of the money is not going into new weaponry. Having said that, I think the bigger, if you're looking at it in strictly historical terms, the big distinction, the big change came after 9/11. That's what changed the politics of the defense budget in a way that the military and military contractors, I think, were largely glad for, because we saw President Bush, who had come into office, if you recall back in the 2000 campaign, he actually promised a smaller increase in military spending than Al Gore had promised, and a very modest $5 billion a year relative to the baseline at that time of about $300 billion. And so if we had done that, we'd be up around, you know, $330, $340 billion a year right now. Today's defense budget actually is pushing $500 billion when you factor in the costs of the war. But the big change happened, and the change that benefits the military industry happened after 9/11. The Iraq War has actually been a mixed bag for the military contractor base because, again, most of the money we're spending on it is not going into the high-tech weapons that they would like to be building. And in fact, to some extent, it may begin to compete. The cost of the war may begin to compete with the cost of new weaponry. That hasn't really happened yet, but it could begin as we get more serious about the deficit. So I'd say it was the 9/11 change that did more to help the defense contractor base, and the Iraq War has been much more of a mixed bag.
What kind of variables or views would the Iraqi population use to measure the factors that you've measured?
Well, first of all, again, a very important question. One of the reasons we include data on the crime rate is because Iraqis do care about that. And it doesn't show up when you're tracking progress in a war, because it's not necessarily people killed by either side in the war. But they do care, because it gets into this broader question of political psychology. Do they think they're better off today than they were under Saddam? Do they think that we have done a good job of liberating them? Do they feel grateful to us? The answer is, you know, overall their views of the United States have been quite negative for about a year to year and a half by any of these public opinion polls. And part of the reason is the crime environment. And so on that one, yes, the reason we include data on this, our data on this is lousy. We get piecemeal data. We get, you know, every so often a journalist goes to the morgue in Baghdad and counts bodies with certain kinds of injuries and tries to figure out which ones of those were killed in a hail of gunfire or by an explosive and which ones were killed in some kind of a random murder. And that's the kind of data we have to rely on. But we insist on trying to measure it anyway because it's so critical to how Iraqis view progress in their country. That's part of my answer to your question. The other part of my answer would be to say, I agree with your point, which is why I emphasize the limited utility of any number, but what we try to do is measure everything. Anything we can get good data on, we put in there, because we're not smart enough to know what's most important. And I do have strong views about the crime rate and the unemployment rate. I will always try to have something on those in our index, even if the data is very mediocre. And I'll telegraph how mediocre it is. But I want people to keep thinking about those two indicators, because the Iraqi people care. And so I agree with your premise, and that's why we're constantly trying to include more, measure more, and keep things in there that the Pentagon or the State Department may not provide data on. We've got to keep thinking about anyway, even if the data is mediocre.
The specific question, is there anything invidious about the press reports of Syrian Scud firings, specifically a prelude to some kind of, or an invitation to American action there? And the question behind it is perhaps the role of Israel in our decision-making process.
I think that the argument about improving Israel's security was one of many, but I don't think it was the most important in the Bush administration's thinking. I believe they were more worried about Saddam's likely threat, and again, I'm just guessing, but I think they were more worried about his likely threat to his immediate neighbors, because they're the ones he could reach. And if he ever had a nuclear weapon, he might have thought of it as an insurance policy, so that even if we decided to intervene again, we couldn't overthrow him, because he had the nuke as a deterrent against our march on Baghdad. So I think that was that was the more likely worry about Saddam. Not that he was going to help al-Qaeda, not that he was going to attack Israel, but that he could again become a threat to Kuwait, for example, which a lot of Iraqis really think is their 19th province. So I'm serious, and I think that that's a legitimate worry. Whether it was enough of a worry to justify war, you can be your own judge, but I think it was a serious worry and a greater one than the likelihood that Iraq could find a way to threaten Israel directly. Having said that, Saddam was funding, along with a number of other Arab leaders, terrorist attacks against Israel. And his antipathy for Israel was well known. He had made threats in the past. And as you say, there was this history from Desert Storm. And so I have no doubt that was seen as a useful potential benefit. But I don't think it was the predominant argument. In terms of Syria's threat, you know, again, Syria, it's very interesting to watch Syria. I know this group has been, because you've had some people speaking on that topic of late, if I recall correctly. But Syria is very interesting to watch. They obviously are not pulling a Gaddafi and, you know, trying to come clean on everything, but they're trying to come clean on enough so we don't march west and invade them next. And Assad's playing this very delicate balancing game, as far as I can tell, where he helps us just enough to make sure that there doesn't develop a big movement to overthrow his regime. And yet, at the same time, he doesn't want to seem like he's being cowed or intimidated, and so he always makes sure that he does enough to reassure his generals, reassure his hardliners, and keep us from feeling too good about how we've converted his behavior. And so I think the Scud missile firings fit into that framework very nicely. I wish he didn't do them, but that's Assad.
Would you comment on education, and then precede that by answering the question of where's the money coming from?
Well, you know, the Baathists were corrupt. We all read about the oil for food scandal. They were skimming hundreds of millions of dollars a year for a long time, even in the period when the UN was watching them like a hawk, or we would hope they were, and we were trying to ourselves. And so there's every reason, and some of that was off in bank accounts they can no longer access overseas, but a lot of it was in cash in hiding places. So I'm operating under the assumption these people have as much cash as they're going to need, and we're not going to win this war by depriving them or waiting out their cash supply. I think they've got plenty to keep giving $50 and $100 here for the next decade, because of those kinds of stashes they've had for quite a while. Education, good point. The quality of the textbooks in Iraq is getting much better, because it's not written by Saddam Hussein anymore, the curriculum. The number of kids in school has gone up, and last time I saw data by maybe 20%, which is pretty good, and that's a decent improvement, because Iraq under Saddam, at least in terms of some of these basic necessities, it was better than a lot of countries in the world, because they had oil, and you know, they had a certain amount of infrastructure that worked, and now we have more kids in school today than under Saddam's regime. So yeah, I think the education is moving in the right direction on both those points.
Two questions. Would you comment on border security and what engines might actually drive the economy?
On border security, there's good and bad news. The good news is that even though they're porous, it's still a small fraction of the insurgency, the foreigner component, probably 5%. The bad news is those are the people, as far as we can tell, who are detonating most of the car bombs and the suicide bombs. And that's become one of the 2 or 3 biggest problems in Iraq in the last, I mean, it's obviously been a problem ever since August '03 when the first big attack occurred, and UN headquarters was attacked that same month that the Iraqi mosque was attacked. And so we had a lot of attacks even back in 2003, but it's gotten even worse since then. As to how much better it's going to get, I don't think it's going to get that much better. We don't have a lot of forces out there, and the Syrians are going to play this game of helping us enough to keep us from invading, but not help us so much as to really make the job doable, because they want us to be bogged down just the way we are, or to go home, one of the two. The last thing they want is for us to get our momentum and feel like we're doing really well, and now we can think of other things to do with our military, because they're a little paranoid. But again, they're not, I don't think they're too paranoid, because they know that they can sort of dial the rheostat on how much they cooperate, and they do it, depending on whether they think they need to be a little more cooperative or less. The source of economic growth, yeah, it's not going to be easy. You're right to put your finger on that, because you know, there's a certain amount of entrepreneurial energy in Iraq, from what I understand, and people do say they're among the best businessmen in the Arab world and so forth. But the Arab world on the whole has had some trouble with getting a strong educational system going. The Arab Human Development Reports, written by Arabs themselves, have noted how weak their science base is, how much further they have to go at generating that kind of economic strength. And this is a problem more generally in the war on terror overall, that we have a lot of people in the Islamic world who don't have good opportunity economically. And that makes them a little bit more receptive, perhaps, to the cries of extremists. I don't know what to do in the long term. I'll just give you, I mean, it's a tough problem. I'll just give you one short-term thing I would do as much as we can, which is our commanders have these commanders' discretionary funds, you know, sort of walking around money. When I went to Iraq, Dave Petraeus was up in Mosul, and he was having, you know, he was basically Huckleberry Finn sort of jobs. Paint that fence, and I'll give you a day's wage. And his people, and they repaired buildings, and they, you know, covered up mortar shell craters, and they got the streets clean, and they just gave a sense of positive movement and gave people money. I would do as much of that as we can invent jobs to be done, even if they have no particular relevance to Iraq's long-term economic development. Because for me, the short-term problem is to stop the insurgency. And if it takes a longer time to develop a really robust economy, as long as we can stop the insurgency, I can live with that more patient time horizon. That's the best answer my non-economist brain can give you.
It profoundly grieves me to be moderator and have to note that it's past 10 after 7. I'd like to thank our guest, Dr. O'Hanlon, for an absolutely splendid evening.